I sat perfectly still, my oxygen tank humming beside me, the only sound in a house I'd paid for, powered and kept running. Across the table, my son rolled his eyes. "That thing's wasting electricity," he muttered, like my breath was some kind of burden. He didn't flinch. He didn't apologize. He just grabbed another beer from my fridge, opened my streaming service, and stretched his feet over my coffee table. That night, I didn't say a word. I just opened my old filing cabinet, pulled out the bills, and made a plan. By the time the sheriff served him, the power was in my name again, and his comfort. Unplugged. Before we begin, may I ask, where in this big, beautiful world are you listening from? It's always a quiet honor to know who's sharing this space. Drop it in the comments, and don't forget to subscribe. The oxygen tank hissed softly as Ruth twisted the valve. The nasal cannula slid under her nose with the ease of ritual. That low hum, always steady, always faithful, filled the modest kitchen like background music to survival. The evening heat pressed against the bungalow's faded walls, but it wasn't the desert air that made her chest tight. Mark stalked past the table, snatching a beer from the fridge without offering anyone else. "That thing's wasting electricity," he muttered, flinging the fridge door shut. "We're not made of money, Mom." Ruth didn't look up. She didn't need to. His tone was the same one he used when kicking trash bins or blaming the thermostat for his overdrafts. A slow, simmering venom, one he didn't even try to mask anymore. Leela, carefully arranging store-bought potato salad in a bowl like it was her own, turned just enough to show her smirk. "Maybe she should use it less," she said lightly, her voice soaked in sugar. Neither of them laughed. They didn't need to. The silence that followed was sharper than cruelty. Ruth placed her fork beside her plate and adjusted the cannula. The meatloaf went untouched. After dinner, she sat alone on the back patio, the sky overhead turning that deep Arizona violet that came just before full dark. The cicadas buzzed. Somewhere down the block, a dog barked once, then stopped. The door creaked open, and Betty Harmon lowered herself into the neighboring chair with the grunt of old bones and indignation. "He said what?" Betty's voice could slice drywall. Ruth inhaled carefully, the oxygen whispering in her nose. "He mocked my breath." Betty's jaw clenched. "That tank is your life. That bastard mocked the one thing keeping you here." Ruth nodded slowly, her gaze fixed on the horizon where the last sliver of sun burned out. "Then I'll take his comfort," she said quietly. It wasn't revenge. Not yet. It was recognition, a quiet shift of gravity. Inside the house, Mark turned up the TV, the bass thumping through the walls like a taunt. The sound barely registered anymore. What Ruth noticed instead was the click, the soft, constant click of thoughts falling into place. At midnight, the house was asleep. She moved through it like a ghost, oxygen tank dragging behind her on squeaky wheels. In the spare bedroom, under an old quilt, a file crate waited. She slid it out with both hands, knees creaking. Dust rose like ash in the moonlight. Inside, records, envelopes, utility bills, bank statements, all filed with the diligence of a former secretary who never trusted auto-pay. She didn't rush. She read, verified, annotated. Her pen scratched softly against yellow legal paper. Dates, payments, notes, month after month of expenses paid. Hers and theirs, with Mark's name never appearing once. The numbers didn't lie. They never had. By morning her eyes were bloodshot and her coffee cold. But the plan was beginning to breathe, a small pulsing thing just beneath her rib cage. When Betty knocked on the door with a cinnamon bun and iced coffee, Ruth was already dressed. Slacks pressed, button-up ironed, that old pin from her county clerk days fastened to her collar like armor. "You going somewhere?" Betty asked, eyeing the tote bag on the table, bulging with folders. "I'm going somewhere he'll never follow." Betty sat, flipped open a bill, and whistled. "You've paid almost every utility, and his credit card's linked to your checking." Ruth gave a single nod. "He complained about pennies." "I counted dollars." From the living room came the muffled sound of Mark's voice. Once Mom's gone, bills won't be a problem. Ruth didn't flinch. She turned toward the hallway, walked to the coat closet, and pulled down the metal lockbox she hadn't touched in years. Dust clung to its hinges. Inside, a bundle of savings bonds, copies of her will and folded tightly in the back, the original deed to the house. She spread everything across the kitchen table: documents, proof, history, her life, itemized. His reckoning, prepped. Betty's eyebrows rose. That's a war chest. No, Ruth murmured, her voice steady. That's leverage. The oxygen tank hummed behind her, quiet, constant, powerful, just like her. The receipts stretched across Ruth's table like a battlefield, columns of dates, decimals, and proof. Her fingers shook not from age or illness, but from restraint. Rage needed purpose, and now it had numbers. She circled one electric bill after another. Ruth's name, her payment, her sacrifice. Air conditioning during Phoenix summers wasn't optional. It was survival. Yet Mark had never paid a dime, not one. Still he stood in her kitchen each week, belly full, feet cool, voice loud. Betty leaned over the table, flipping through a thick folder. My God, Ruth, you've paid most of these anyway. Internet, gas, his streaming services. Your retirement account's keeping the lights on in this house. Ruth didn't blink. And now he'll pay in another way. She tucked a receipt into the binder's sleeve, slow and deliberate. The oxygen tank whispered beside her, a quiet chorus to her planning. By mid-morning, the sun scorched the front walk as Betty helped her load the tote bag into the back seat. The air outside was dry enough to flake skin, but Ruth didn't notice. Her focus narrowed to a single destination. Alan Reyes' law office sat 2 blocks from downtown, tucked between a mortgage lender and a bakery that smelled of cinnamon and yeast. The reception area buzzed faintly with fluorescent lighting and the low murmur of an old ceiling fan. Ruth had called ahead. He was waiting. Alan looked younger than Ruth remembered, with kind eyes and a posture that suggested he knew how to fight, and had. His handshake was firm, but not performative. Ruth liked that. She eased into the seat across from his desk as Betty remained standing, arms crossed like a sentinel. Ruth didn't waste time. These, she said, sliding the folders forward, are my bills. All of them. I've been paying everything, even after he moved me into his house. Alan flipped through the files with quiet efficiency, occasionally stopping to highlight, nod, or jot a note. After 10 minutes, he set down his pen. Mocking a medical device, he said slowly, while siphoning your funds and rerouting utility control to himself. That's financial abuse. No question. Ruth adjusted the cannula beneath her nose and met his gaze without blinking. Then prescribe him court filing. Betty let out a short, sharp laugh behind her. You always did have a way with words. Alan leaned forward, hands folded. I can file a financial elder abuse complaint. If we document this right, the payments, the forged authorizations, the shared accounts, we can build a case for restitution and control reallocation. Restitution? Ruth asked. He'll have to repay every cent stolen. Alan said. Possibly more. Ruth's voice was low. Good. Let him pay for the air he tried to steal. The air in the office was cool but charged, like static just before lightning. Outside, life carried on. The traffic, the laughter from the bakery next door, the distant rumble of a truck backing into a loading dock. But inside, something fundamental shifted. Ruth wasn't surviving anymore. She was preparing to fight. After the meeting, they drove back in silence. The late afternoon sun had softened into a copper haze as Betty pulled into Ruth's driveway. The house looked the same, but it no longer felt like his kingdom. Across the street, Mark leaned against the neighbor's fence, beer in hand, grinning like a man who thought himself invincible. The neighbor chuckled at something he said, shaking his head. Mark's voice carried across the yard. Once Mom's gone, bills won't be a problem. Ruth stepped out of the car slowly, her hand on the oxygen tank handle. Betty moved to help her, but Ruth raised a hand. She walked up the path alone. The breeze caught the edge of her blouse, fluttering it like a flag. Inside, the house smelled like air conditioning and lemon soap. Sterile, still. Ruth closed the front door behind her and locked it. She set the tote bag back on the table, unzipped it, and stared down at the documents again. But this time, something new rested beside the paperwork. Alan's business card. Clean, crisp, dangerous in the right hands. Ruth exhaled, steady and slow. Let him keep bragging, she muttered. The oxygen machine hummed, and the war began. The hum of the oxygen machine filled the dining room, soft and steady, a mechanical breath for lungs that once danced through decades of laughter, labor, and loss. Ruth sat at the head of the table, fork in hand, though her appetite had left hours earlier. Mark's knife scraped his plate, loud and jagged. That sound, he muttered, pointing his fork toward the tank beside her chair, is going to drive me insane, like a damn fridge that won't shut up. Ruth didn't flinch. She sliced a piece of chicken, slowly, carefully, each movement quiet and measured, the way she used to trim margins from paperwork at the courthouse, making every line count. Across the table, Lila sighed dramatically and reached for the salt. It's like living with an appliance, she said with a thin smile. Whirring and clanking all day. No wonder the electric bill is sky high. The chicken turned to paste in Ruth's mouth. She swallowed hard. No reaction, no glance up. Her hands, though, gripped the fork tighter than she meant to. She didn't need to defend herself. Not yet. Mark reached for his beer. Told you she won't be around forever. Then we can finally reset this place. Ruth didn't look at him, but her eyes moved to the corner of the room where the old family photo used to hang. Mark had taken it down last year. Claimed it made the room feel like a retirement home. The oxygen tank hummed on. Later that night, Ruth sat at her desk under the small amber glow of her reading lamp. The tank had been switched out. The new one was heavier, fuller, steadier, like her. She pulled her leather-bound journal from the drawer, the pages filled with years of meticulous handwriting. She flipped to the latest section, offenses. July 14th. Dinner. Called me an appliance. Said I was temporary. Laughed at the sound that keeps me alive. She underlined temporary twice. Her pen moved slowly, intentionally. No anger, just documentation. The phone buzzed quietly beside her. A single vibration. A message from Alan. Filed for freeze. Should lock joint accounts within 48 hours. Will update. She let out a small breath. A smile touched her lips, not of joy, but of progress. The next morning, Betty walked in without knocking. As she often did, she tossed her purse on the counter and held up 2 iced teas like they were trophies. Filed already? She asked, peeking at the phone screen. Alan doesn't waste time, Ruth said, taking the tea with a nod of thanks. Betty popped the top off hers. This is the beginning of blackout, she said with a grin. Ruth didn't smile, but her eyes glinted with something sharper than humor. Not for me. They sat together as Ruth pulled out another folder. This one marked shared utilities. The pages were still warm from the printer, copies of account statements and emails Mark never thought she'd see. Betty scanned the top page. Wait, what's this? Ruth leaned over, her oxygen tank purring softly. Alan found something else last night. Just forwarded it. Betty read the email slowly. Her face changed from curiosity to confusion, then to pure disgust. He added his name to your electric account? Ruth nodded. 2 months ago. Digital authorization. Never told me. Betty stared at her. He's claiming he manages your electricity. Ruth opened the next envelope, eyes scanning calmly. Then he's about to learn who really pays for power around here. The oxygen machine clicked softly. As the pressure adjusted, a steady breath in the charged silence. Ruth flipped to the next page and began highlighting names, her pen gliding smoothly. Surgical certain. Outside, Mark was mowing the lawn in loops, earbuds in, oblivious. Inside, Ruth carved his fraud one signature at a time. The man who never paid a single electric bill had signed his name across her lifeline, and Ruth Carter now had the proof. Alan Reddy's held the utility report between two fingers, like it smelled bad. Here it is, he said, laying it gently across the table between them. Digital authorization submitted in April. He added himself as primary account holder. You were bumped to secondary. The fluorescent light in Alan's office flickered once before steadying. Outside, monsoon clouds hovered low over Phoenix, thick and gray, electric in every sense of the word. Ruth didn't reach for the paper. She simply stared at it, like it was a snake that had slithered through her front door and curled itself beneath her bed. He wants control over my breath, she said softly, the cannula hissing in time with her pulse. Then he'll choke on debt instead. Alan gave a grim nod. We're filing a fraud complaint with the Arizona Utility Regulation Board today. I'll have supporting documents in their hands by lunch. Ruth exhaled. Even the tank's mechanical rhythm seemed to calm. He's gotten too comfortable, she said, almost to herself. He's gotten too stupid. Alan corrected. Across town, Mark stood in the driveway, wiping down his truck, the hose spitting dust off the tires. Ruth sat by the window, unseen. Her hand rested on the worn arm of her recliner, fingers still and deliberate. Leitel's voice rang out from inside, loud, performative. Just updated our billing again. I swear I do everything around here. Ruth closed her eyes. A second later, the phone in her lap buzzed. Betty again. You've got to see this post. She tapped the screen and stared. There was Lila on Facebook, a filtered selfie beside the thermostat, captioned when you're the one running the whole house. Bills, decisions, everything one Sulamite hash. Household queen, Betty texted again. Took screenshots. Already saved. Ruth didn't reply. She didn't need to. The kettle on the stove clicked as it began to boil, a thin whistle building from nothing. Ruth let it scream a little longer than usual, before turning it off. Later that afternoon, Betty arrived with a bag of groceries and fury behind her eyes. You were right not to have Facebook, she muttered, slapping the printed screenshots on the kitchen table. She's out here talking like she pays the mortgage. She doesn't pay the paper towels, Ruth murmured, flipping one of the pages over. But now they're writing checks their names aren't on. I called my friend Jackie at the regulation board, Betty added, pulling up a chair. She said once fraud is filed, if it sticks, the utility company has to revert everything and flag the account for oversight. Good, Ruth said. She picked up her pen and turned to a new page in her journal. July 15th, unauthorized transfer of utility account. Lila flaunts false control. Screenshots attached. The tank hummed beside her, a calm, relentless rhythm, like the ticking of a countdown clock. The next morning, while Lila rearranged the living room pillows like she was filming a lifestyle show, a plain envelope arrived in the mailbox. Ruth didn't touch it. She let Mark find it. He came in sweaty from yard work, tearing the envelope open by the fridge. His jaw clenched as he read. Due to unresolved discrepancies, control of all utility services has been reverted to the original sole account holder, Ruth Carter. The silence in the kitchen was sudden and complete. Ruth sipped her tea. The ceramic clink echoed. Mark stood frozen, the notice trembling in his hand. What the hell is this? Ruth didn't answer. She didn't need to. The lights were still on, but not for him. The air inside the house was thick with heat and tension, not from a broken air conditioner, but from a storm that had finally hit the ground. Ruth sat in her recliner, oxygen tank humming quietly at her side. She could feel the electricity in the walls, not the kind that powered the lights, but the kind that comes before a fuse blows. Outside, cicadas screamed into the afternoon sun. Inside, the kitchen door slammed open. What the hell is this? Mark's voice cracked like a whip across the living room. Ruth didn't move. She didn't even blink. She just looked up slowly, eyes steady on her son's red face. You stripped me off the utility account, he barked, waving a crumpled letter in his hand. Who the hell do you think you are? I think, Ruth said calmly, adjusting her nasal cannula, I'm the one whose name was there from the beginning. His jaw flexed. You went behind my back. I followed the law, she said. You faked authority. That's the difference. Mark threw the letter onto the coffee table. You're nothing without us, Mom. You'd be living in a home if we hadn't taken you in. Ruth reached for her tea. The ceramic cup was warm in her fingers, the smell of chamomile soft in the air. We'll see. Lila hovered in the hallway, silent, her eyes flicking between them like a spectator afraid to pick a side. The silence that followed was long, long enough for Mark to feel it press against him. He turned on his heel and stormed out, the front door slamming so hard the picture frames rattled. That afternoon, Ruth sat with Alan in his office again, legal pad open in front of him. This time she wore lipstick, a soft rose color, something about dignity even in war. We're not just freezing accounts now, Alan said, tapping his pen against the table. We're filing a civil fraud suit, utility fraud, unauthorized account access, financial elder abuse. He turned your lifeline into leverage. That ends now. Ruth nodded once, then slid a copy of the letter across the table. They removed his name. They acknowledged he forged digital consent. Alan smiled, but there was no warmth in it, just precision. Good, that's the first domino. She leaned back, exhaling slow. He thought I needed him, but the only thing I needed was proof. Alan gathered the documents and stood. We'll serve him within the week. Back at home, Betty was already waiting on the porch when Ruth returned. She handed her an iced tea, condensation slipping down the sides like sweat. He's sulking, Ruth asked. In the garage with a wrench and a Bluetooth speaker, Betty replied, sitting down. Noise and nonsense. Classic male panic. Ruth took a sip. Alan's filing. Suit's official. Betty's face lit up. Then it's time to cut more cords. Every one. The sun dropped lower in the sky, casting long shadows over the neighborhood. Ruth closed her eyes and listened, not to the music Mark blasted in the garage, but to the power she'd reclaimed. Every sound had meaning now. The hum of her tank, the ice shifting in Betty's cup, the slow tick of change. 2 days later it happened. A white sedan pulled into the driveway just before dinner. No logos, just plain clothes and purpose. The man who stepped out wore a badge clipped to his belt, and a no-nonsense face that said this wasn't his first time serving justice. Ruth watched from the window as the sheriff approached the front door, a thick envelope in hand. Mark opened it in a tank top and gym shorts, holding a can of soda. His cocky smile vanished the moment he saw the papers. What the hell all is this? He snapped. The sheriff didn't blink. You've been served. Civil suit. Fraud, financial abuse, damages. I suggest you read it. Mark's shoulders tensed. Lila peeked from behind him, her face pale. Inside, Ruth didn't smile. She didn't need to. She turned off the lamp beside her. One less light. Mark could pretend to control. The mailbox screeched open like it knew what was coming. The sheriff's sedan idled at the curb, engine ticking in the Phoenix heat. A few houses down, sprinklers hissed against dry grass, but all eyes were fixed on one front porch, Mark Carter's. Ruth sat behind the living room curtains, the breeze from her oxygen machine the only sound she trusted. Betty leaned beside her, arms crossed, watching through the blinds like it was a courtroom drama, and popcorn was overdue. Mark opened the door shirtless, still in gym shorts and socks. The sheriff didn't flinch. You've been served, the deputy said, voice flat and formal. The manila envelope hit Mark's chest before he grabbed it. Eyes narrowing. Across the street, old Mr. Henderson paused mid-sweep of his walkway. 2 teenage boys on bikes stopped talking. What the hell is this? Mark growled. The deputy was already walking back to the car. Fraud, financial abuse, civil suit, all detailed inside. Mark's voice rose. You can't be serious. The door slammed so hard, the porch light flickered. Inside, Lila stood near the hallway, frozen in place. What does it say? She asked quietly, her voice tight. Mark ripped the envelope open and skimmed the top sheet, his face drained. He's suing me. She's suing me. With a lawyer. He slammed the papers down on the kitchen island, pacing. This is garbage. She's exaggerating. Manipulating. We took her in. Lila picked up the papers, scanned them quickly, then flinched. Mark. He filed an injunction. Mark spun. What? Look. She pointed to the section mid-page. Alan Ray is filed to freeze every account with your name and hers. Joint or otherwise. Immediate approval. No withdrawals allowed. He snatched the papers back, reading harder this time. No, no, no. This is a bluff. He can't actually. She has the utility board on her side. Lila said, quieter now. You know that, right? They already kicked your name off the bills. Mark rubbed his face with both hands, then hurled the envelope across the room. I did everything for this house. You added your name to her accounts, Lila said, not unkind, but without any warmth either. You spent her money. This is what happens. Silence expanded like a gas leak. Mark looked at the floor, then the ceiling, then back to the papers as if one of them might blink. Across the street, Betty sipped from a sweating can of Diet Dr. Pepper and grinned. Electric silence. Feels good. Ruth nodded slowly. Her oxygen machine released a soft puff. The current just shifted. They didn't speak after that. They didn't need to. The door had been slammed, but it was already wide open now. To courtrooms, restitution, truth. An hour later Alan called. They're frozen, he said. Every account we flagged is under injunction. I pushed it through the judge myself. Ruth allowed a breath of satisfaction. Thank you. He'll try something. Alan warned. People like that always do. I'm counting on it. And he did. That same night, while the cicadas buzzed like static in the mesquite trees and the kitchen clock ticked past midnight, Mark sat at Lila's laptop in the guest room. His fingers moved fast. Teeth gritted. Chase. Capital One. Discover. He tried each one, checking old usernames, resetting passwords where he could. Finally. A hit. One he thought he'd buried years ago. A high-limit card opened in Ruth's name, but redirected to a separate mailing address, a P.O. box he once claimed was for business. There it was. Still active, still hidden. He stared at the screen, chest heaving. She's not getting all of it, he muttered. I'll move it before they touch it. From the hallway, Lila's voice floated out like fog. Whatever you're doing in there, you better make sure it's legal. Mark didn't answer, but the cursor blinked in the search bar, a soft, digital heartbeat, counting down to his next mistake. The man had buried it deep, under fake email addresses, P.O. boxes, and just enough arrogance to think no one would ever look. But fraud leaves fingerprints, and marks were all over the stolen money trail. Alan's call came early, just after sunrise. Ruth was brewing her coffee, the house still quiet, except for the soft purr of the oxygen machine beside her. The mug in her hand trembled slightly as she lifted it. I found something, Alan said, and you need to sit down. Ruth was already seated. Tell me. There are 3 open credit cards under your name, all applied for using your social, your birth date, and one of your old addresses, but the billing statements are going elsewhere. A P.O. box in Chandler. She didn't speak, just tightened her grip on the mug. Steam drifted up past her glasses. One of them, Alan continued, has charges for a resort in Sedona, $2,000 for a suite. Another one shows flights to Vegas, multiple electronics purchases, and an outdoor kitchen set. He spent my breath on his fun. Ruth said, her voice thin but steady. He used my life to entertain his. Alan exhaled. I'm filing identity theft charges today, federal and civil, and we'll move to seize any assets tied to those accounts. Ruth didn't smile, but her nod was so firm it might as well have been a gavel drop. Later that afternoon, Ruth and Betty sat under the covered patio, watching the wind twist dust devils across the cracked sidewalk. Betty's eyes stayed fixed on the stack of papers Ruth handed her. 3 credit cards, she muttered. In your name. 10 years of dignity, Ruth replied, and he converted it into airline miles. Betty shook her head, thumbing through the statement pages. This is like a blackout with no candles. Pure darkness. The trial will bring light, Ruth said simply. Inside, Mark paced the living room like a trapped animal. The mail had stopped arriving. Online portals were inaccessible. He'd tried to move the P.O. box account, but found it frozen by court order. Lila sat on the edge of the couch, silent, phone in hand. She hadn't said much since the sheriff's visit, and what she had said came out clipped, careful. "Do you want to talk to someone?" she asked. "Like a lawyer." Mark shot her a glare. "We don't need a lawyer. We need this old woman to stop pretending like she's the victim here." "She is the victim," Lila said, voice dropping. "You're the one who signed her name on things." Mark stood there a moment, chest rising and falling, then turned and stormed out the front door. 2 days later, Ruth sat in the county courthouse across from Alan, the cool air inside a relief from the oven-like heat outside. She wore her navy slacks again, and her good flats. Her cannula rested gently on her cheekbones, as much a part of her look now as her reading glasses. The judge read through the charges, expression neutral but hardening as the evidence mounted. Alan handed over the statement, screenshots, digital authorizations. "You're telling me," the judge said, looking up at Alan, "that this defendant, her son, stole her identity to finance trips and home upgrades, while maintaining control over her utility access." Alan didn't blink. "Yes, Your Honor, and we have full documentation." The judge nodded once. "Then I see no reason to delay. Full fraud trial is scheduled for next month. Restitution, damages, and possible referral for criminal prosecution." Ruth sat back, her face unreadable, but her shoulders lowered just slightly, as though a hidden weight had finally loosened its grip. That evening, the front page of the Phoenix Sentinel hit driveways across the city. Black bold letters blared across the top. "Son accused of defrauding elderly mother, trial scheduled." The photo beneath it showed Mark mid-step outside the courthouse, hand shielding his face. Ruth wasn't pictured. But inside the house, where the oxygen tank hummed in quiet defiance, Ruth sat with the paper folded neatly on her lap, and a yellow highlighter in hand. The wheels of Ruth's walker whispered against the polished courthouse floor, each slow roll echoing like a challenge. Behind her, the oxygen tank trailed on quiet wheels, humming with a calm that belied the storm she carried in her hands. Courtroom 3. B smelled like old wood, paper, and air conditioning. A bailiff nodded as Ruth entered, his gaze shifting respectfully toward her cannula. She offered nothing but a brief glance, and kept moving, Alan at her side carrying a leather briefcase packed with truth. Across the aisle, Mark slouched in a navy blazer that didn't quite fit. He was smirking, cocky, performative, the same face he wore when mocking her oxygen machine at dinner. Lila sat beside him, posture stiff, makeup heavy, like she thought this was a casting call and not a fraud hearing. She clutched a fake leather purse like it might keep her safe. Alan leaned in. "He's nervous. The confidence is a costume." Ruth didn't bother looking their way. "I didn't come here to study actors. I came to turn off the spotlight." The judge entered. Gavel. Rise, silence. Case number 4587. Carter versus Carter. Alan stood. "Your Honor, we are here to present preliminary evidence in a civil suit involving elder financial abuse, unauthorized identity usage, and fraudulent access to utility and credit accounts." The judge, a stern woman in her 60s, gave a single nod. "Proceed." Alan moved like a scalpel. Precise, quiet, devastating. He placed the utility bills in a neat stack on the evidence table. "These are monthly electric bills paid exclusively by the plaintiff, despite the defendant claiming household control." Next came credit card statements, each marked with yellow tabs. "These charges include out-of-state travel, luxury goods, and unapproved purchases, all billed to accounts opened in the plaintiff's name without consent." Photos, emails, screenshots of Lila bragging posts. He presented them all. No theatrics, no fluff, just fact. Mark shifted in his seat, jaw clenching, glancing at the jury box despite there being no jury yet. This was pre-trial. But the courtroom was full. Local press sat in the back. A few neighbors from Ruth Street were scattered in the benches, pretending not to look. "Mrs. Carter," the judge said, "do you wish to address the court?" Ruth stood slowly. The room went still. She walked forward with Alan's hand steadying her arm, the oxygen tank following like a faithful soldier. "My name is Ruth Carter," she said, her voice clear. I worked 40 years, paid every bill that came through my door, and raised a son who decided I was easier to steal from than support." She paused. The hum of her tank filled the silence. "I didn't come here to shame him. He did that himself. I came here to reclaim what was taken. Dollars, yes, but also dignity. And that has no interest rate." The judge studied her, chin resting in hand. After a long pause, she turned toward Mark. "Do you contest the evidence?" Mark stood, flustered. "She's just angry. She asked to move in. I've paid for groceries, gas, things she doesn't even, receipts," the judge asked. Mark blinked. "What? Do you have receipts for those expenses?" He stammered. "No," but the judge raised a hand. "That's enough." She scanned the bench one last time. "The court finds sufficient cause to proceed. A full trial will be scheduled. Claims for restitution and damages are approved to move forward." Lila's shoulders dropped. Mark sat, jaw twitching. Ruth turned back to her seat, every step deliberate. As she passed Mark's row, she didn't look at him, but the soft wheeze of her oxygen tank whispered a truth he couldn't deny. She was still breathing, and now she had the court behind her. The courtroom buzzed before the gavel fell. Low murmurs, rustling paper, the tense air of a town gathering to witness a reckoning. Every seat was filled. Even the hallway outside was lined with curious locals peeking through the door's narrow window. They knew the name. They'd seen the headline. Ruth Carter sat at the plaintiff's table, dressed in charcoal gray slacks and a crisp blouse. Her oxygen tank wheeled quietly behind her, its rhythmic hiss steady, defiant. Betty was in the first row, hands folded tightly, eyes locked forward. Alan stood beside Ruth, calm as ever, papers arranged in lethal order. Mark strutted in like he still owned the room, wearing a dark suit that screamed discount rack and desperation. His jaw was tight, but the smirk still flickered, until he noticed the jury. 12 faces, all watching, all older than 30, none amused. Lila trailed behind, thinner than before, her lips pressed into a permanent line. She didn't speak. She barely looked at Ruth. The bailiff called the court to order. Judge Myers entered, eyes sharp beneath silver hair. "State your case." Alan stood, buttoning his jacket with slow precision. "She lost power," he began, turning toward the jury. "He lost humanity." A murmur stirred. Alan continued. "We will show you documents, bank statements, forged applications, utility bills and credit accounts opened in Ruth Carter's name, and used without consent. We will show proof of identity theft. We will show that while she lived quietly with a medical condition requiring oxygen, her own son exploited her breath for luxury." He turned slightly, gaze landing on Mark. "This is not a case of misunderstanding. It is a case of malicious sustained abuse disguised as family duty." Mark scoffed loudly. Alan paused, then returned to the table. The evidence began to flood in, month after month of utility bills in Ruth's name, credit card statements marked by vacations she never took, screenshots of Lila's online bragging, recordings of Mark's taunts from dinner conversations Betty had quietly captured on her phone, each piece stacked like a brick. Each one built the wall between Mark's lies and the jury's patience. Ruth never flinched. When asked to testify, she stood slowly, adjusted her cannula, and walked to the stand with the same care she'd once used navigating marble floors at the courthouse where she'd worked 3 decades. Her voice was low, but unshaken. "My son told me I was wasting electricity," she said. "While using my name to fund his credit cards, he mocked the machine that helps me breathe, while stealing the air out of my future." The courtroom fell silent. Even the judge leaned forward slightly. When Mark took the stand, the mood shifted. His tone was defensive, then erratic. "I let her stay with us," he barked. "She's lucky I didn't charge her rent." Alan rose. "Did you spend her money at Desert Horizon Resort in Sedona?" Mark waved his hand. "It was for us, for the house. Stress relief. And the gaming console." Mark hesitated. "That was a misunderstanding. What about the outdoor kitchen set? Or the airline tickets to Vegas?" "Objection," Mark snapped suddenly. Even though he wasn't a lawyer, the judge raised a brow. You don't get to object from the witness stand, Mr. Carter. You get to answer. Laughter broke through the back row. Whispers turned into full sentences. Unbelievable. Trash. Mark slammed his hand on the armrest. She's lying. The bailiff moved slightly forward. The judge's gavel came down. Order. Now. Alan leaned to Ruth. He's doing our work for us. When the closing statements ended, the jury was sent out. 15 minutes later, they returned. Eyes cold, faces grim. The four persons stood. We, the jury, find in favor of the plaintiff, Ruth Carter. A single exhale rippled through the room. The defendant is liable for full restitution of $138,642, plus damages. We recommend court-ordered liens and asset seizure. Mark slumped. Layla turned away. But Ruth sat straight. Eyes forward. Machine humming beside her like applause. And outside, a tow truck idled. The sound of a hydraulic winch groaning to life echoed down the quiet suburban street like a funeral bell. Mark's cherry-red SUV, polished just days ago, tilted upward as the repo truck slowly lifted its front wheels off the driveway. It was 10:04 a.m. on a Wednesday. Ruth watched from her front window, unmoving, the oxygen tank purring beside her chair like a loyal pet. The tow operator moved methodically. No yelling, no debate. He'd done this 100 times before. Only today, it wasn't just a vehicle being hauled away. It was a facade. Layla burst through the front door barefoot, mascara smudged, shrieking like the house was on fire. That's my husband's car. We're calling the judge. You can't just. The repo agent, unfazed, pointed to the clipboard. Court-authorized lien. Filed yesterday. Title flagged. Non-negotiable. Across the street, two neighbors stood on their porch, filming with phones out, mouths tight. A few more watched from behind blinds, ducking between glances. Mark came out half a minute later, red-faced and breathless. This is harassment. Ruth leaned forward slightly in her chair, adjusted her glasses, and sipped her tea. That's the hum I prefer, she whispered. Betty, standing beside her with arms crossed, let out a low whistle. This neighborhood hasn't seen action like this since the Wilsons' dog bit the mailman. Only now, Ruth said, eyes still fixed on the scene. It's not a bite. It's a chokehold. 2 hours later, they sat in Alan's office. The windows were open to the summer breeze, but the mood was business cold. Restitution funds have been deposited into a protected trust, Alan said, typing rapidly as he spoke. Only your signature can authorize access. No co-signers, no shared power of attorney. You're in control of everything again. Ruth nodded once. That's how it should have stayed. He slid a document across the desk. This account is judgment-proof. Not even bankruptcy can touch it. Betty raised her eyebrows. You really don't leave doors open, do you? Alan smirked. Not after they're kicked in. Ruth took the pen and signed slowly. Her hand trembled, but not from fear. You understand, Alan added, this lien process is just the start. Vehicle bank accounts, retirement holdings. Once we press for closure, we'll seize equity on the house too. That house, Ruth said, voice measured, was built on lies. Let it collapse. Back in the neighborhood, the SUV was long gone. A stain of oil marked where it once sat like a throne. Inside, Mark paced the kitchen, speaking too loudly into the phone. I told you I'm working on it. No, I haven't seen the paperwork yet, but I know who's behind this. It's that damn lawyer. Hers. They're trying to bleed me. Leela sat on the couch, curled in on herself, rubbing her temples. It's not just them, Mark. It's the court. The judge, the jury, the law. Maybe if you stopped shouting and started fixing. Don't you start, he snapped. She stood slowly. We should have never taken her in. There was a beat of silence, not the kind that invites apology, but the kind that cracks foundations. The next morning, Ruth opened her door to a familiar uniform. Morning, Miss Carter, the sheriff said, holding a single sheet of official paper. Ruth stepped aside as he tacked it to the utility pole in front of Mark's house. A bright orange sticker fluttered in the breeze. The block grew still as people stepped out to read it, one by one. Notice of foreclosure. Property to be auctioned. Court-authorized lien enforcement. Ruth stared at the sign. It shimmered slightly in the sun. Betty walked up beside her, arms full of groceries. "Well," she said, squinting, "comfort just shut off." Ruth nodded, her voice low but sure. "And the lights won't be coming back on." Inside the house across the street, Mark finally noticed the quiet. No TV, no AC, no car, just the sound of defeat, and the knock he wasn't ready for. Because Ruth hadn't just taken him to court. She was taking the house next. The sound of metal striking wood echoed down the street like a drumbeat of finality. Thud, thud, thud. The sheriff hammered the foreclosure notice into the front yard, while the summer wind lifted dust and dead leaves around his boots. Mark stood frozen on the porch, mouth half open, face a storm of disbelief and rage. His bare chest glistened with sweat, the morning heat already brutal.
Yeah.
Behind him, Leela peeked through the door, eyes rimmed in red, a roll of packing tape dangling from her wrist. "You can't do this." Mark barked, storming down the steps. "This is my house, my home. We've lived here for years." The sheriff didn't even look up from the final nail. "This property's been seized under court order. Auctions in 30 days. You've been served more than enough notice." Mark grabbed the paper, yanking it halfway off the stake. "This is harassment. It's personal." The sheriff calmly reattached it. "No, sir. It's public record." Inside the house, cardboard boxes were stacked like tombstones. The living room walls were bare, echoing. Lila wrapped a framed photo of her and Mark at a dinner party, face unreadable. Her hands worked fast, mechanically, the tape gun shrieking each time she sealed another box shut. The living room no longer smelled like scented candles or air freshener, just dust, dry air, and something sour like spoiled pride. "Where are we even going?" she asked. Not turning around, Mark stormed in from the porch, still red-faced. "It's temporary. I'm calling a lawyer." "You already have a lawyer," Lila said quietly. "No, a real one." Lila sat on the couch, one of the few things not yet wrapped, and finally looked at him. "She took everything, Mark, and now she's taking the walls around us. Maybe it's time to admit we did this." "We?" he snapped. Lila stood. "I've packed your stuff too. You can stay at your sister's." His mouth opened, but the words didn't come. Lila turned away, picking up a box labeled kitchen and walking it to the front door. Across the street, Ruth sat in the passenger seat of Betty's old sedan, the window down, breeze rolling in against her arm. Her oxygen tank rested beside her feet, humming gently with each breath. The car was parked under the shade of a low Palo Verde tree. She sipped her iced tea and watched Mark rant in his yard like a man unraveling thread by thread. "Funny," Betty murmured. "Not long ago he said the bills would be easier once you were gone." "I am," Ruth replied. "Gone from his books, at least." Mark kicked a box on the lawn. Lila didn't flinch. Ruth took another slow sip. "You want to drive past or sit a little longer?" Betty asked. "I like this view," Ruth said. It's the first time that house has told the truth. Later that evening, as the sun melted into the desert horizon and the foreclosure sign leaned gently in the breeze, a heavy silence settled over the Carter household. Mark sat at the dining table alone, flipping through foreclosure documents with shaking fingers. His phone buzzed beside him with unanswered texts. The curtains were drawn, the air conditioner off. It was too hot, but he didn't care. On the last page of the packet, in bold black ink, was the auction date, September 6th, 9 a.m. His knee bounced under the table. His mouth tasted like metal. A thought crept in, dark, desperate, undeniable. He opened his laptop, logged into his financial dashboard, and stared at the negative balances across his accounts. Then he clicked the tab labeled Debt Relief Services and began filling out a petition for Chapter 7 bankruptcy. He didn't cry, but the cursor blinked at the end of his name, like a flat line. Mark Carter sat in courtroom 4C, Hands clenched so tight, his knuckles turned bone white. The air inside was still, heavy with stale coffee and fluorescent light. His suit jacket was wrinkled, shirt collar stained slightly with sweat. The clerk called his name, and he stood, not with confidence, but with the mechanical reflex of a man who had nothing left to stand on. Judge Myers glanced up from the file, her face unreadable. "Mr. Carter," she said, "you are here to finalize a Chapter 7 bankruptcy claim, filed on the basis of insolvency, repossession, and asset forfeiture. Do you confirm all submitted documents are accurate and truthful to the best of your knowledge?" Mark nodded. "Yes, Your Honor." Her eyes didn't soften. "Your accounts show zero liquid assets. Vehicle repossessed. Primary residence foreclosed. Multiple judgments entered against you, including the restitution order to your mother, Ruth Carter." He winced at the name. She said it without pause. The gavel came down, once, sharp and final. "Bankruptcy is granted. All non-exempt assets are subject to seizure. This court grants no further motions. This case is closed." Just like that, everything was gone. Outside the courthouse, the sun glared off the concrete like punishment. Leela stood near the edge of the steps, arms crossed, suitcase at her feet. Her sunglasses hid her eyes, but her posture said more than words. Mark stepped toward her. "Leela, wait, please." She didn't flinch. "I lost everything. I know, but this wasn't supposed to happen like this. I can fix it." "You burned it, Mark," she said quietly. "All of it. Our savings, our home, your mother's dignity. You don't fix something like that." He looked at the suitcase. "You're leaving?" "I already did," she replied, turning away. "This is just the luggage." She climbed into a rideshare without looking back. The door closed. The car pulled away. He was alone. 3 miles across town, Ruth opened the mailbox with steady hands. Inside was a certified letter from Alan. She carried it inside, sat at her kitchen table, and peeled the envelope open like the final piece of a puzzle. Inside, confirmation of bankruptcy proceedings. Attached was a second letter, signed and notarized, full release of claim, protected trust verified, no contest pending. She exhaled slowly, oxygen tank purring beside her. The house was quiet, but not empty. It was hers again. Every inch, every breath, every quiet moment. That evening, Betty arrived with a casserole dish that smelled like baked cheese and fresh herbs. She kicked off her shoes at the door and popped open 2 chilled lemon sodas. "I don't care what the court calls it," she said, scooping out helpings. "This is justice pie." Ruth chuckled, softly. "I'll call it peace with seasoning." They sat together at the table, the television off, the windows open. The air smelled like honeysuckle and dusk. It had been a long time since Ruth had eaten without glancing toward a door, listening for someone to judge the hum of her machine. Alan called midway through the meal. "It's done," he said. "No appeals filed. Statute prevents relitigation. He's out of time, and out of tricks." Ruth didn't say much, just a quiet, "Thank you, Alan," followed by a long contented silence. "He's done," Alan repeated, as if he needed her to hear it again. This time, she smiled. The next morning, a folded newspaper landed softly on her porch. Betty brought it in with the mail. Ruth unfolded it, and laid it flat on the table. The front page headline caught her eye, printed in bold black. "Man declares bankruptcy after defrauding elderly mother's utilities." Below the headline was a blurry photo of Mark outside the courthouse, head down, hands in his pockets, alone. Ruth sipped her coffee. The tank beside her hummed, low, steady, powerful. So did she. The courthouse lights hummed overhead, casting a sterile glow on the last piece of paperwork Ruth would ever file against her son. The oxygen tank beside her purred faithfully, a rhythmic whisper that had followed her through every insult, every slammed door, every stolen dollar. But this wasn't about retribution anymore. It was about redirection. Ruth signed the form with a steady hand, then looked up at Alan, who watched her from across the desk with a mix of admiration and disbelief. "You're sure you want to do this?" he asked gently. "I've never been more sure of anything," Ruth said, slipping the pen back into her purse. that money was never meant to rot in court records. Alan glanced at the check she'd just handed over. "You're donating the entire restitution?" "To the Energy Relief Network," she confirmed. "Low-income seniors, winter heat, summer AC, emergency bills. No one should have to choose between breathing and surviving." Alan leaned back in his chair, nodding slowly. "They'll name it after you, you know. I didn't ask for that. They'll do it anyway." The dedication ceremony happened 3 weeks later under a cloudless Arizona sky. Folding chairs were set up under a white tent, and a banner waved overhead in soft, purposeful letters. "The Ruth Carter Fund for Energy Independence." Local news crews circled the perimeter, quietly filming. Former utility board members mingled with retirees, staff from the charity, and neighbors who had once only known Ruth as that quiet lady with the tank. Now they knew her as the woman who'd turned humiliation into heat and manipulation into empowerment. She sat near the podium in a pressed cream blazer, a flower pinned to her lapel. Her oxygen tank had been upgraded, smaller, sleeker, easier to carry. Beside her, Betty fanned herself with the event program, and grinned like a proud parent. "You pulled every plug, Ruth," she whispered. Ruth nodded, eyes on the podium. "And I never touched the cord." One by one, speakers stepped up to share stories. Seniors who had received help when their utilities were cut. Single mothers who avoided eviction because of energy subsidies. One man who survived the July heat wave because someone paid his air conditioning bill on time. At the end, a woman from the charity took the mic. "All of this," she said, "was made possible because one woman chose not just to take back her power, but to share it." Applause rolled like thunder. Across town, Mark Carter sat on a broken lawn chair outside a weekly rented efficiency apartment. The air was hot and sour. His phone was dead. His bank account empty. The last of his credit cards had been canceled that morning. His only mail was junk. He'd applied for 3 jobs. All rejected. The man who once bragged about running the household now couldn't afford a fan. He rubbed his face, then lit a cigarette with a matchbook from a bar. When he exhaled, the smoke hung in front of his eyes, clouding everything. He'd mocked her oxygen. And now? He couldn't breathe. That night, Ruth's grandchildren came to visit. It had been months since they'd come willingly. Their parents always used to drop them off like an obligation. But now they knocked excitedly, one holding a school art project, and the other a copy of a local newspaper article. "Grandma," shouted Ava, the older one, "we saw you on TV." "I told my whole class," her brother Jake added. "You're famous." Ruth smiled, warmth spreading through her chest in a way oxygen never could. They climbed up beside her on the couch, chattering and bright, completely unaware of the wreckage that had cleared the path for this piece. Betty snapped a photo of the moment. Ruth centered, her grandchildren curled beside her, the oxygen tank visible but no longer defining her. After they left, Ruth sat at her desk in the soft lamplight. The sky outside was cooling into a deep rust orange, the desert sun folding in on itself. She pulled open a drawer and reached for a notebook, thick and blank, its leather cover still smelling faintly of newness. She opened to the first page. At the top, in bold, deliberate script, she wrote "Breathless Revenge." A true story below it, in smaller letters, by Ruth Carter. For every woman who's ever been underestimated, and every breath she reclaimed. She tapped her pen once against the margin. And then she began to write. Applause rose like a wave across the Phoenix Community Center auditorium, loud and sustained. Every seat was filled. Folding chairs lined the back walls. Even the fire chief had shown up, pressed uniform and all. At the center of it all sat Ruth Carter, a small woman wrapped in soft blues and silver jewelry, her oxygen tank tucked discreetly beneath her seat. She didn't look like someone who had started a public fund, taken down a fraud case, and reset the legal tone for elder protection in the city. But everyone in that room knew the truth. Alan stepped up to the podium, papers in hand, eyes gleaming under the spotlight. Some people speak loudly, others act quietly, but once in a while, he said, we meet someone who does both, and still somehow makes the world lean in to listen. A few heads nodded. Betty wiped a proud tear with the back of her hand. Ruth Carter, Alan continued, didn't just fight back. She rewrote the playbook. She didn't seek revenge. She built legacy. The Energy Relief Fund that bears her name has already saved over 200 families from power shutoffs in just 4 weeks. And it's just the beginning. He gestured toward her. She reminded this town that strength doesn't always show up in noise. Sometimes it hums beside you. Steady, quiet, relentless. The room rose to their feet. Ruth stood slowly, carefully, with Betty on one side and a volunteer helping with her tank on the other. Her eyes scanned the crowd. The same neighbors who once whispered behind curtains, the same block that had let her disappear into the background for years. They were standing now. Not because she was fragile, but because she'd proved she wasn't. Later that week, Ruth sat at her dining room table, a stack of legal documents in front of her. The air smelled like lemon cleaner and fresh paper. Alan passed her the last sheet to sign. This one updates the estate, he said. It secures everything: house, trust, insurance, even the royalties on your memoir if it publishes. Ruth signed without hesitation. And Mark? Alan asked quietly. He gets nothing, she said. Not bitter, just firm. And not because of what he did to me, but because of what he taught me about who not to protect. Alan gave a small nod. Your grandchildren? They're listed first. She tucked the documents back into their envelope and slid them into the drawer, locking it with a key she now wore on a simple silver chain. The next time Ruth stepped out for groceries, the cashier recognized her and gave her a discount. The woman behind her in line asked for advice about setting up auto pay for her mother. Even the man delivering her oxygen tanks called her ma'am now, not sweetheart. Betty noticed too. You used to be invisible around here, she said, as they sipped iced tea on the porch. Ruth smiled, slow and satisfied. I didn't disappear. I was charging. The neighborhood had changed, or maybe it hadn't. Maybe it just finally saw her clearly. Mark, on the other hand, had vanished. No one said his name anymore. No one asked about him. His old friends stopped waving. The whisper network that once laughed at Ruth's quiet breathing now erased him with silence. That was the final punishment, not the bankruptcy or the lawsuit. Oblivion. At sunset one evening, a truck pulled into Ruth's driveway. 2 workers in dusty uniforms stepped out and began unloading solar panels onto the side lawn. One of them tipped his cap. Full rooftop install, he asked. Ruth nodded. Battery backup too. Betty looked up from her garden clippers. You going green now? I'm going untouchable, Ruth replied. The panels gleamed as they were lifted onto the roof, catching the last of the desert light. The same roof where Ruth once had to ask for permission to turn on the AC. Now the sun would power everything, including her. And inside, beneath the soft mechanical hum of her oxygen tank, a lamp clicked on, not because someone allowed it, but because she chose to. The future had a new grid, and she owned every wire. The desert was quiet, not empty, but purposeful, like it had chosen stillness over noise. Ruth Carter sat at the edge of the overlook. Sunlight stretched long across the rust-colored cliffs. Her oxygen tank rested beside her, humming faintly, a loyal companion breathing in tandem with her. The same machine Mark once called a waste now whispered the rhythm of her freedom. She adjusted the cannula gently, eyes half-lidded against the golden light, as Betty unscrewed the cap from a dented thermos. Best seat in Phoenix, Betty said, pouring steaming coffee into 2 mismatched mugs. And no one here trying to control the thermostat. Ruth smiled. Or the bills. They clinked mugs together. Soft laughter carried off by the breeze. Below them, the desert stretched wide and endless. Ocotillo stems flickered in the light wind. A hawk circled far in the distance, wings spread like punctuation over a chapter closing. Her phone buzzed in her lap. She glanced down at the screen. Alan Reyes. She answered, already knowing. It's official, Alan said. Bankruptcy discharge confirmed. No appeals filed. No motions. He's legally dead to the court. Ruth didn't exhale immediately. She waited a beat, listening to the hum of the tank, to the wind moving across rock. Then, good. Let that silence echo louder than any apology he never gave. Alan chuckled. If you ever run for office, I want the first donation form. She hung up with a soft click, then opened her banking app. The screen glowed with bold, clean numbers. Her accounts, secure and untouched. No red alerts. No shared access. No ghosts in the wiring. Just solvency. Locked in her name alone. The wind shifted, warm but light. The kind that brushed your skin without asking for anything in return. She heard the quick shuffle of sneakers behind her, and turned as Ava and Jake climbed the overlook path, cheeks flushed pink from the climb, their backpacks bouncing as they ran. Grandma. Ava beamed, holding up a copy of Ruth's memoir. Mom said they're selling out at the bookstore. Jake grinned, already digging through his backpack. I marked my favorite chapter, the part where you tell the judge he can keep his courtroom, because you already took back your home. Ruth laughed, deep and full. That line was Betty's, actually. Betty raised her mug. Damn right it was. The four of them sat as the sun melted low, streaking the sky in orange and lavender. No yelling, no shame, just the sound of breath, real, mechanical, peaceful. Ruth reached down and ran a hand along the smooth edge of the tank. My son said my oxygen tank was wasting electricity, she murmured. So I cut off his power, his credit and his comfort forever.